What's good, mini crafters? My name is Samuel. I love painting minis, building dioramas, and my favorite apocalyptic weapon of choice would probably be a scimitar of some kind. Why mention that? Because in today's video, we're going to be building an apocalyptic diorama endearingly called the Canal of Rot. Cue the intro. I freaking love the apocalyptic genre, whether it's a zombie virus that's taken over the world or it's a dusty wasteland where everyone's scavenging for resources. And something that I thought would be kind of cool to do would be build a diorama that captured a slice of an apocalyptic world. Not long ago, I painted up some soldier minis, which I'll have the video linked in one of the corners of the screen that you can check out. But as I finished the painting of these minis up, I realized I wanted to have a setting for these little guys. Additionally, a few months ago, I also saw a neat diorama by the talented Costas Georgiou called Dead Canal. The project that I'm working on here is inspired by his work, however, I put my own twists on it and ended up making my own version. To start, I'm going to be creating some tiers of foam to give the scene some elevation. It will be a sort of cutaway view of a canal that's drying up. Next, I'm wanting a set of stairs that lead down into the canal bed. Normally the stairs would be half submerged by water, but in this scene we'll be able to see the floor bed, so the whole set of stairs will be visible as well. Now, of course, we got to add in some trash, debris like wood planks, oil barrels, and of course there's going to be lots of greenery growing as well. Now, up on the canal walkway, I'm not going to build an actual building, but rather I'm envisioning a sort of backdrop facade that looks like a warehouse, complete with a door, window, garage door, that sort of thing. I'm also thinking about throwing a rotting boat in the canal as well. And lastly, I'll add in my army squad of 4, along with some infected that I painted up as well. Yeah, that's right. I do childlike drawn animations now. And that wasn't the only one that's going to be in this video, so get ready for that. I'm starting with some XPS foam and stacking up the initial shape of the land. I want the wall of the canal to sort of be at an angle rather than straight across. I think this is going to look more interesting, but it also is going to give me enough room to fit in all of my apocalyptic details. I'm building up 2 layers on top of my initial layer, which gives me the height that I want and keeps everything in scale. My thought here would be that a person standing in this canal wouldn't have their head be above ground level. To make sure that these layers of foam are in the shape that I want, I'm using a handheld hot wire foam cutting tool. I don't have a tabletop hot wire foam cutter, so I'm trying to keep everything lined up and straight as I work. Going slow is good. The good news is that any imperfections here will be covered and corrected later, so if you're repeating this, don't worry if you don't get perfectly clean cuts. Here, I'm cutting out a block for what will become a staircase. Initially, I thought I wanted to put a ladder in for access to the canal bed, but I decided to switch to stairs to let me have some room for my squad to maybe be heading down into the canal towards the end of this project. Next, I wanted to add a building facade to this scene to create depth and suggest the idea that the scene continues on past what's in the diorama. This will likely be some sort of warehouse or industrial building. I needed this to be a straight cut piece of foam, so I decided to hand cut this in place of using the hot wire foam cutter. And I used my extendable hobby knife to allow me to go all the way through the thick foam. This took me a few passes, so if you cut your foam this way, be sure to go nice and slow and gradually deepen the cut each pass that you do. After that was done, I added it to the back right corner of the base. I'm thinking I may add more there to the left, but I haven't fully flushed that out. Something that you're going to notice me doing here in the beginning and throughout this project is I'm not staying tied to a particular thought. I'm kind of feeling this out as I go, and if I think something might look cool, I try to work towards that end. This also gives me a little bit of freedom so that if something doesn't look exactly the way I anticipated it would look, it still gives me some wiggle room to integrate that. Typically, when I work on a big project like this, I tend to get stuck in analysis paralysis, which just essentially means that I'm researching, looking at different ideas, being online, doing everything but the making of the project itself. And so I decided to kind of use this as a practice for me to forge ahead and just start making things and creating shapes, and then let the details settle in later. I wanted to make sure I was actually making the project rather than just thinking about it. I knew I wanted the canal walls to be detailed and look realistic. I also didn't want the foam layers I had built up to be visible. To accomplish both of these, I made some thin foam wall siding, which will look like the big concrete slabs that you see with retaining walls and canal sides. Past the stairs section, I placed thin green XPS foam sheets. Now, I accidentally cut my piece too short when I was lining up the edges, but I took this as an opportunity to add a split in the wall, as if a crack had formed over time. I cut a jagged piece of XPS foam the same thickness as the wall siding, and I added it next to the first panel. This got me to the edge of my scene. Now that I have the general forms in place for this scene, I need to get the stairs figured out. And this can be a bit tricky to get a uniform set of stairs when working by hand, but I do have a couple of tips that might help you when you're doing this. First, we need to figure out the scale of the diorama so that the stairs don't look cartoony and huge. But we also want to make sure that they don't look too small for our minis. When I 3D printed my minis, I had them in 1/48 scale, which has a 6-foot person at around 1.5 inches tall. Knowing my diorama is going to be also in 1/48 scale helps me to get the measurements that I need for the stairs. And after a quick Google search, I have what I need. Now, for another poorly drawn animation. There are 3 measurements that you need to be aware of to get the most uniform steps that you can. The first is step width, which, in 1/48, is 19 millimeters, which would end up being 3 feet in scale. The second is the depth of each step, which, in 1/48 scale, is 5.8 millimeters, or 11 inches in scale. And the third is step height, which ends up being around 4.3 millimeters, or 8 inches in scale. Obviously, if you're struggling to get 0.8 or 0.3 millimeters as you measure your stairs out, that's all right. It's important to keep your steps uniform in shape each step of the way. Yeah? Puns? Okay. Now, I'm not going to be using the hot wire foam cutting tool to cut out these steps. I don't have the patience or the steady hands required to do the zigzag motion and not accidentally misalign the steps. If I had a hot wire table, I probably could, but I don't. What I will be using the hot wire foam cutter tool for is to remove the bulk of the foam block. That way I can get my hobby knife in there and cut out the individual steps without making a lot of extra work for myself. I'm using my extendable blade so that I can reach all the way across the step and not have to cut in from both sides separately. This allows me to minimize the risk of misaligning my steps. I cut down and then slowly push my knife in from the side to get each of the steps' shapes right. This is a slow process, so don't rush it. If you do mess up at any point, that's okay. You can either go back with the blade and shave off bits of foam to straighten things up, or if your scene is apocalyptic or more worn down, you can just call it some extra weathering that you definitely meant to do. Sure. Now that I have my main shapes and base built out, it's time to start gluing things down. I'm starting with the 2 primary layers of foam that make up the ground. Before I apply any glue, I'm taking some sandpaper and roughing up the surface of the foam that the glue will be on. This gives the smooth foam some teeth and helps the glue adhere better. I'm using normal tacky glue and spreading it out all over the foam with a spare piece of foam. This ensures that I have a nice even coat. I then repeat the same process for the second layer of foam and firmly press everything down. I ended up adding my water cup, the glue bottle, and one of my decorative wine bottles as weight to sort of ensure that the foam didn't move around while the glue cured. Once I get things glued in place, I'm going to be painting everything. And this means that any textures that I want to show through need to be done prior to the painting. The first thing that I'm going to be texturing is the concrete canal wall. I want this to look like big concrete panels. And to do this, I'm first going to take a pencil or hobby knife and make some lines in the foam. The first line is going to be a horizontal one in the lower 1/3 area. And then I'm going to do another one, but it'll be vertical and it'll be right down the middle. This creates a sort of sectioned look, so it's not just a big piece of concrete. That would be boring. From there, I'm going to be taking my wire brush and gently drag it across the lower horizontal section. I'm using my ruler to protect the upper sections as I'm going to do that next, but I want the grain to be going vertically, whereas right now I want it to be going horizontally. I do want to emphasize how gentle I am being with the wire brush. If you push too hard, you risk tearing your foam up or causing little burrs and pills to form. With the lower horizontal section done, I'm going to take some tape and cover that. Then I'm going to take the wire brush and add some texture from top to bottom, vertically. Once done, I'm going to take a balled up piece of tin foil and I'm going to roll it and press it into the foam to give it a little bit of extra texture. Well. It is your main man, Editor Samuel, helping out Hobby Samuel because he is an idiot who deleted the footage that gives credit to the hobby master Carson over at Small World Workshop.
I had a little stint in my script where I wanted to give credit to him, and I'm doing that now because he has a video on his channel where he creates a super realistic concrete sidewalk. And I used that video to inspire myself and translate that to creating my canal walls. So please head over to his channel, check out the video, check out his channel, drop him a subscription, and tell Hobby Samuel to stop deleting all the footage, because this is very unprofessional. Come on, man.
Now it's time to add ground texture to the ground areas. You can buy all sorts of pre-made ground textures, but I'm going to be making my own, the very same that I used in my Dwarven Mine entrance project. Be sure to check that video out if you haven't already. To make this, you're going to need a few different things. Here you can see dirt, fine ballast, plaster, matte Mod Podge, and water. Mix up all the dry ingredients until they are well incorporated. And once it's thoroughly mixed, add some matte Mod Podge and water in. I'm going for a type of consistency that's chunky yet spreadable. If it ends up being too dry, don't be afraid to add some more water a little bit at a time. I'm taking my paste and I'm putting it down on the canal bed, being sure to go to the very edges. Once the paste is down, I'm going to be adding the fine dirt to the still wet paste. Not only does this help to add more texture to the ground, but it can really help soak in some excess liquid from the paste. I'm also going to come in with some larger stones and ballast to add some more texture and different sized natural debris. With the canal bed and wall texturing done, I'm jumping back up to work on the building facade. I decided that I want to have some sort of delivery bay or garage door on this canal, and I'm going to start by cutting out the section where I want the big garage door to be. Once this is cut out, I want to add some detailing to the sides to create a more realistic garage door entry rather than just having a big square hole in the wall. I'm using a variety of balsa wood strips to build up some layers to outline the garage door entrance. And for the garage door itself, I'm making some corrugated metal sheets that I'll later glue together. To get this scale sheet metal, I'm using a super handy tool appropriately called the Corrugated Iron Maker by Brunel Models. It's super easy to use as long as you go slow and make multiple passes with the press. Essentially, you place a piece of cut tinfoil on the grooves of the tool, and then with the other piece, you firmly but gently press and drag the tool across the surface of the tinfoil. Flipping the foil and doing the same thing gets rid of any curves, and once done, you're left with a perfect in-scale piece of corrugated metal. I saw the incredible Luke Towan use this handy device on one of his ultra-realistic dioramas, and I had to pick one up for myself. Please be sure to check out his video on this tool and all of his other great projects. I'll have it linked below. And shout out to Luke Towan for showing me how to use this awesome tool in his video. As I went to add the corrugated metal to the back of the garage door, I thought it might be a bit more interesting to have the door be partly open. To achieve this look, I added a small strip of cardboard that I painted black just below the corrugated metal that I made. While I know it's not perfectly depicting depth or an open garage door, I didn't want the viewer to be able to look through the door and through the scene itself. Initially, I had recessed it a bit to create actual depth, but I couldn't get it just right with the light coming down from above, as well as not having left myself much room between the back of the facade and the edge of the diorama. So I ended up making the black painted cardboard piece flush with the door. I'm starting with the first building facade on the right side of the diorama. I want this to be a brick building with a door on it. Later on, I'm going to add some details such as an air conditioning unit. To get the brick texturing that I want, I'm going to be using the same process that I used in my very first YouTube video, where I showed you how to carve brick and stone into foam to get a realistic wall. I go more in depth on that process, and if you want to check out that video, I'll have it linked in the upper right hand corner of the screen. I started by taking a ruler and pencil and lightly penciling in the horizontal lines as well as the vertical lines of each brick. I'm not worrying if I'm a bit crooked or off in terms of measurements, as that's only going to add to the realistic hand-laid brick look that I want. Of course, make sure that that's within reason, otherwise you risk your facade looking a bit too chaotic. After penciling in the bricks, I'm going to be taking my hobby knife and slice some shallow lines everywhere that I penciled in. I'm only going about a third of the way into the foam, and I used my ruler for the horizontal lines, and then I freehanded the vertical lines. Now that I've made my cuts, I'm using some metal dental tools and a gray clay shaper tool to create some space between all of the bricks. This is where I round the edges of bricks, create space, and even have a few bricks torn out to create some deterioration and variety on the wall. Now this may seem slightly out of order, but I'm actually going to paint the bricks up before doing the last step of adding the grout. And this is because when I add my grout, I know it will be messy and add a fine layer of texture to the bricks, which I want because this is a decaying apocalyptic scene after all. Now I mix some brown and red together to get a darker red brick color. I water it down a bit to help with flow, and then I paint each brick. You could vary your colors if you wanted, and I do a little bit as I go, adding some more brown or more red to a few bricks to break up the single color. And while it looks really vibrant right now, adding that grout, which we're about to do, will help dull it down and really pull the whole look together. After the paint dries, it's ready for scale grout. Now I've adjusted my grout recipe a few times in the past, but have settled on this one as it gives me the best effects that I'm always looking for. I'm mixing together an equal amount of 1 part fine sand and 1 part plaster to get this homogeneous mixture that actually doesn't really look like I mixed anything together. I'm using an old brush to spread and push the grout mixture into all the cracks and spaces between the bricks. Once the cracks are filled, I brush off any excess grout mixture on the surface of the individual bricks. It's going to leave a dusty coating on the surface, but I actually want this as it's only going to add to the effect that I'm going for. After getting all the grout in place and removing the excess, I first apply a misting of isopropyl alcohol to the wall to break any surface tension for my glue. Next, I apply my homemade scenic glue to lock everything in place. It's super simple to make, and there will be a video coming on how to do that soon. But for now, it's just water, Mod Podge, and some dish soap. But there are a few great tips and tricks that I've learned that I think can help. Let me know in the comments below if that's a video you'd be interested in seeing. To get more accurate placement of the glue, I'm going to be using a little dropper. Don't worry if it pools and gets all over the surfaces of any bricks. I left it alone and it slowly seeped into the cracks and grout mixture. Now, as everything settles and the glue seeps down, it's going to leave a nice grout patina that only adds to the overall look of the wall. Now I know penciling, etching, cutting, and shaping bricks on a brick wall is a not very fun and unsexy part of the process, but I think when all said and done, it really draws the eye and helps create a realistic scene. But you know what is a sexy part of the process? Adding some cool ass little details and props that make people say, whoa, this diorama's got some cool ass little props. When I think of an apocalyptic setting, I think of debris, worn down items, and sometimes just straight up trash everywhere. For a particular apocalyptic scene, it's important to try to incorporate props that make sense to that area. You wouldn't have a bunch of children's toys at a coal mine. Well, I guess unless a group of children survivors took over a coal mine, then they would need toys for entertainment, and I guess, you know what I mean. Apocalyptic child mine workers aside, I wanted to pick props that made sense for my Canal of Rot. Things like oil barrels, wooden pallets, and discarded tires seemed to fit nicely. I got most of these props from STL sites such as My Mini Factory, and I 3D printed them myself. I then primed them up and hit them with paint. I like to paint my props as if I never planned to weather them. This helps to get the original color and the look that they're supposed to be. Then, from there, I'll add grime, dirt, and weather them up. As you can see here, the weathering doesn't have to be anything crazy for each prop. The cone was simply hit with a black wash, while I decided to spend some more time on the AC unit. I had accidentally broken one of the fins on the propeller, and I decided to break the cage that went over it so that it looked broken. What I didn't 3D print, I made by hand. This little wooden pallet was easy to do, and I think it'll add a nice touch of realism to the scene. It just took a bit of balsa wood, some glue, and a quick wash of Agrax Earthshade. I think it's so fun when unexpected ideas pop up when doing projects like this. The props that I just showed you were sort of there for me to pick from, but when I was working on the foam layers and getting the general shapes in place for the scene, I was cutting off pieces of foam left and right. And as I worked, I saw this particular piece of foam in my scraps pile, and I thought it kind of resembled some sort of half-submerged something in the canal. I thought of one of those old-timey white fridges that were used in the 1950s, and I started carving away at the corners to round it out. Once I had the shape that I wanted, I hollowed out the back, added some bits that I had laying around, and now it looked like a real fridge. I painted it all white and then hit it with a bunch of colors to weather it up. I used browns, tans, oranges for rust, and even added some green around the base since I thought it would be cool to have this sort of half submerged in the canal. After working on all the props for as long as I could to avoid figuring out how to paint or texture the garage door facade, I finally had to face the music. Psst. Hey, yeah, you. Over here. Hey. Fine. I wasn't totally sure how I was going to make this facade look. I knew I couldn't leave the garage door itself unpainted, as the metal would look too shiny and too new for an apocalyptic setting. So I thought I'd try to add some brown and black washes to it, knowing that it may not stick very well or look exactly as I wanted. After a few layers, I got some grime built up, and I actually like how some of the metal shines through the grime to give it a cool weathered look. After some internal deliberation, I decided that I wanted to have the building be concrete and broke out some of AK Interactive's concrete paste. This stuff is perfect for creating scale concrete, and while I've usually only used it on floors and ground spaces, I thought I would give it a shot on a wall surface. And it ended up working great, and I applied it in a thin layer over the whole surface to get an even coat. Along the top of the space where it gets narrow, I used a brush to tease the paste out a bit so that it wasn't thick or clumpy looking. I also didn't apply the concrete to the balsa wood acting as the garage door's border. Now I have a concrete-y looking wall facade. Now, I often get in my own head when working with a new process or technique or trying something that I haven't done before. And while I liked how the texture of the wall looked, I wasn't totally sure about the color and how it would interact with any washes that I threw on it. So I got a little bit antsy and I jumped straight to adding washes to see if it would work. I broke out some of Vallejo's black and brown and mixed up a bit of tan with colors that were already on my wet palette. I applied the darker wash colors to the edges, nooks, and corners of the concrete where I figured grime would naturally gather and settle. I then took the lighter colors, like the tan, to the center part of the walls to brighten that up and show some color variation. I go back and forth between the lighter and darker washes to start to create a patina over the concrete. I focus the darker areas toward the ground, and once I get to a spot that I like, I let everything dry. As we all know, concrete can have tons of different colors, different wears and tears, different washes and shades to them. So I encourage you to try different processes, different mixtures, and if you like it, keep doing it, and if you don't be afraid to come back and try something new. I got really excited about how the concrete facade ended up looking, and I already had some colors for weathering on my wet palette, so I decided to paint up and weather the canal wall. I started with a tan color, giving everything a base coat to start. From there, I added browns, grays, blacks, and other additional tan colors. I added water to thin my paints, and I focused on corners, nooks, and recessed areas to get the look I was after. As I worked and I went from panel to panel, I was treating each as its own wall. I focused grime and soot at the bottom of each panel and the sides, while keeping the upper and middle areas lighter. This helped to create a more realistic look to me, since weathering doesn't happen in a totally uniform way. To push this even further, I took some watered down black and a thin brush, and I started to create random grime streaks on the wall. I started at the top and brought them down towards the bottom, not usually going from the very top to the very bottom, and I narrowed them as I went. It was a subtle effect, but I think it really brought the wall weathering to the next level. As I sat looking at my stairs, I was happy with the weathering, but I really wanted to add some sort of hand railing. And I've seen hobbyers do tons of different things and use different materials to achieve this, but something that I had been kind of thinking about and wanted to try was experimenting with solder that you use with a soldering gun. This solder I have is super malleable and bendable, and it looks to be the thickness that I would have in scale for this type of hand railing. I snipped some off the spool and started to fiddle around with it, bending it here and shaping it there until I got it to a point that I liked. Now, if you notice, I don't have the railing going all the way down the steps, and that's because I realized if this canal was full of water, you wouldn't need a railing going all the way down, or otherwise half of it would be submerged. One slight downside here is that you have to work in a single piece of solder unless you're going to glue bits. Now, I would suggest soldering the pieces together, like a railing and its support piece, but that would absolutely melt the whole thing since this is literally solder. I'm going to be gluing in the main pieces first and then adding the support beam later. I ended up hitting that with some super glue to hold it in place as it dried. And of course, I couldn't leave it all purty and nice. I had to bend and break it to add some apocalyptic deterioration to the overall look. After getting the railing in place, I wanted to add some orange-brown rust streaks coming from the base of each of the points where the railing was inserted into the concrete. It was a subtle touch that I think really helped to add some realism and better integrate the railing into the scene. Now for the concrete on the upper level. To achieve a convincing concrete on the upper level and to fill the various gaps, cracks, and spaces in the foam, I decided to use AK Interactive's concrete paste. the same that I used for the garage door facade. This time, I needed to make sure that I had a thin, even layer to emulate nicely poured concrete slabs. Don't worry, I'm going to be weathering them up here in a moment. To keep them even and make them level, I used my plastic painting knife to spread the texture over everything. After getting the bulk of the paste down, I used my paintbrush to suss out some of the areas that weren't flat or that I needed to tease out a bit to look more natural. Here, you can see how the paste looks while it's still wet. It starts to dry relatively quickly, so I'm going to have to work quickly to get these next couple of steps done. While the concrete is still wet, I'm taking a toothpick and adding slab lines to the surface. I'm eyeballing the spacing and keeping it relatively equal in spacing. From there, I use my toothpick to add random cracks and lines in the paste to create the appearance of an older concrete that's wearing and tearing. And the last thing to do while the paste is still wet is to hot glue the building facades in place along the back of the scene. This is so I can see where they will sit, let the AK concrete settle around it, and then smooth out any awkward lumps, hills, or areas that look weird in the concrete. After that's dry, I'm coming at it with lots of washes and super thin down paints. I'm using a variety of colors, namely light and dark grays, light and dark browns, some tan colors, and even a bit of an orangish brown color. Again, I've thinned these down considerably and I'm adding multiple layers of each color. Something that helps is adding 2 colors to an already damp area to help them blend together. Or, if you're looking for some color shifting, wait for the first wash to dry before adding another. I did that when I added the orangish brown wash so that it stood out a little bit more from the concrete color beneath it. As you work, you may not feel like you're making a ton of progress, but keep working in little steps and the end result will be worth it. As you can see here, the subtle colors, washes, and hues really sell the idea that this is some realistic, worn down, dirty concrete along a canal. I was quite pleased with how this ended up looking. After the washes are dry, I take some AK Interactive moss effects and mineral spirits and I apply the moss effects to various spots on the concrete. I focus on cracks, the base of buildings, and the edges of the canal. If I feel that it's not showing enough, I add a bit more, working in small amounts, and I thin everything with some mineral spirits. After finishing on the upper level, I wanted to add some of the moss effects to the stairs too. I focused on the corners of the steps and the recessed areas. Now please appreciate how my camera went out of focus here and use your imagination to picture me getting the moss effects in the perfect spot. Once the upper level concrete is weathered up, I'm going to start adding foliage and greenery to everything in the scene. This is going to help show me where I need to put the extra details and props later on. To start, I'm taking some tacky glue and I'm spreading it all out on the concrete with an old brush. From there, I'm sprinkling some fine foliage over that. And after that, I'm taking some more tacky glue and adding it around the crack in the canal wall. I'm going to then take some clump foliage that I have, and I'm going to push that into the glue and the crack to make it look like whatever this plant is growing out of the wall. I then took some static grass, and instead of using a static grass applicator, I manually added it to a few spots in the upper area. I chose some cracks in the concrete to make it look as though the grass had poked through over the months and years. Now, something that helped me to make the tufts stand up better and to stay in place was add a few drops of isopropyl alcohol and then some droplets of my scenic glue to hold those tufts in place. Something that I thought would be kind of neat to add to the scene would be a dilapidated boat in the canal bed itself. Now, there were a few ways that I could have gone about this, but I ended up going with handmade option. I could have gone to online stores like My Mini Factory and bought an STL file. I could have gone to a hobby shop in my area and found a little model, but I wanted to try my hand at scratch building this. I created a simple frame for the boat with some square balsa wood dowel rods. I used my hobby knife to get things cut to size, and then I glued them in place with tacky glue. The back of the boat was made with some flatter, thinner pieces of wood, which I added some wood grain to with a wire brush. From there, I cut those in half and glued them to the back of the boat. I had to stand the boat up on its end to ensure that I had a level surface for gluing the back panels on. After that was dried, I moved on to creating the middle section supports that I would eventually add to the boat and have the siding wrap around on. Initially, I started with some thin styrene sheets, but quickly found that they were too flimsy and wouldn't hold their shape well. To remedy this, I created the same shape of the styrene, but with wood instead, and glued that into place. From there, I'm working with some super thin pieces of balsa wood that were bendable but wouldn't break. This next part couldn't be rushed since I needed to hold the strips in place as the tacky glue dried. And once dried, there was a nice gradual curve from the back of the boat over the middle support piece all the way to the front of the boat. Of course, I needed to cut off the excess wood so it ended at the front of the boat and didn't extend past it. This process took quite a long time, and I don't know if I would do it again, or maybe I would change my process somehow. I'll need to do some looking around to find out how other hobbyers do this, if they do this. If you have a process that you use or any tips, please drop them below in the comments so that we can all learn together. With the minor props down and the boat painted up, I wanted to get that in place in the canal. The slight curve of the boat actually really fit well with the minor grade of the canal bed. And after getting that in place, I let everything dry to get a sense of where everything was. I know I already added greenery to my scene, but something that I thought might help unite the props with the scene was to place some clump foliage on the boat, as well as add some fine turf to the other part of the boat. This would make it look like the boat had been there for a hot minute and nature was starting to reclaim it. And now that the props are in place and the foliage has been added, I just need to get the water poured and the minis added. To prep the area that I'll be adding the water to, I place a strip of tape along the edge of the scene. From there, I take my hot glue gun and I put a bead of glue along the seam where the tape meets the foam. If you want to see an absolute disaster where I mess up this crucial step, you need to check out my Dwarven Mine entrance diorama video. I used epoxy resin for the first time in that video, and it did not go how I thought it would. I'm not using a deep pour resin for this project. Rather, I'll be using AK Interactive's still water. I'm doing this for two main reasons. One, I don't need much water. This is the Canal of Rot, after all, and it's mostly dried up. And two, I'm going to be doing a shallow pour of only about 1 centimeter thick. If I used the deep pour resin, I would have a ton left over, and it wouldn't be deep enough for it to cure correctly. Something that I've found useful when working with still water is to use a toothpick or something like that to tease out the edges. This keeps a lip or curved bump from forming, and it keeps it from making the water look like it's just sitting on top of the scene. Also, this stuff is a bit more viscous, so it doesn't always want to spread out into the nooks and crannies without a little bit of help. Now, I just need to let all of my glue dry, all of my water effects cure, and this will take about 24 to 48 hours. With the water cured and the glue dry, I add my minis, and now the scene is done. Wow, you guys, I am so happy with how this turned out. The dirty concrete, the foliage, the props, and just the whole feel is so apocalyptic. And after adding the minis that I painted up a handful of weeks ago, this just ties everything together. As a lover of everything apocalyptic, I am definitely thinking that I'm gonna have to start making more scenes like this. If you agree and you want to see more apocalyptic dioramas or minis in the future, drop a comment below to let me know. And if you liked this video, please consider subscribing. It's the most impactful way that you can support me and my channel. Also, be sure to share this video with your hobby and apocalyptic friends. That's going to put a bow on this one, you guys. Until next time, keep on crafting.